All right, I think we're ready to start. So good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody in the room. Good morning, everybody joining us online as well. So I'm Brent Middlestat, Director of Research and Associate Professor here at the Oxford Internet Institute. And I'd like to welcome everybody to our event today, Voices in the Code, a practical story about democratizing AI. We're delighted to welcome David G. Robinson. He's going to talk to us today about his new book, which tells a story about how one community built a life and death algorithm in a relatively inclusive, accountable way. So David is a visiting scholar at the social science matrix at the University of California at Berkeley, and also a member of the faculty at Apple University. And he also just told me that he's also a former an alumnus here at Oxford at Balliol from 2004 to 2006, if memory serves. And from 2018 to 2021, he was a visiting scientist at Cornell's AI Policy and Practice project. So the presentation will run for about 40 minutes. We'll have a discussion at the end. And if you're joining us online, please do use the Q&A function. We'll pull up questions from the chat at the end, along with questions from in the room. So, David, it's great to have you, and let me hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. And thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and let's get right into it. So our story begins at this airport Marriott in Dallas, Texas, on a chilly morning in February of 2007. Now, what's happening inside this place is pretty exciting. So in the United States, there are about 100,000 people waiting for a kidney transplant because their own kidneys have failed, and more than 10,000 in a typical year are transplanted. Some, of course, is someone giving to a loved one or to a friend, but most of these organs are donated. Often, so people, if they are at the end of their life and they have agreed to donate their organs, the organs become available, and many people are waiting. Part of what waiting means for kidneys is that you're on dialysis, where a machine periodically cleans your blood of its toxins. It's a much, much better life if you can get it to be transplanted with a kidney and have effectively normal health. And what's happening in this room in Dallas is that a huge get-together of experts of many kinds, surgeons, social workers, data scientists, are debating how to change this matching process. So every time an organ becomes available, there is what is known as a match run, which is a prioritized list of offers saying, first offer it to this patient, and then if they or their medical team don't want it, offer it to this next person, and so on. People often talk about this as a waiting list, but it's actually not a queue. It's a matching process that draws on many different factors: logistical, who's nearby, who's ready; medical factors like who's got the right blood type or who has the correct antigens, so that if they were given the kidney that we're thinking about, they would be able to use it for a long time and it wouldn't be rejected. And there are also ethical questions. For example, to what extent do we want to maximize the total benefit from the limited supply of organs and save the most life, versus to what extent do we want to treat everyone alike and give people a chance, even if for other health reasons, they might not be the very most efficient way of converting that kidney into life years saved. So the idea that's under discussion is called LIFT. This is in the era before ride sharing, life years from transplant. And what you can see here is some of the data science that they did to sort of simulate how would this work in practice. Notice this tag down here. This is an actual slide from Dallas. The Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients is a third party. So the system is run by UNOS, the United Network for Organ Sharing, a federally authorized nonprofit. And I should say there's a similar system here in the UK. But the analysis and the auditing of what's actually happening once the system is in use is done by this third-party auditor. Here, they've simulated. So basically, if you have, so the light blue line at the bottom is what fraction of people who are in kidney failure are still alive X many years later. And what you can see is that if you start at age 20, this blue line, you're likely to live on dialysis longer than if you start at age 60, because of course you're in better health. The yellow line is how long you're likely to live if you do get a transplant. And what you can see here is it's a larger area for the person who's 20 years old than for the person who's 60 years old. So in general, shifting organs toward younger recipients is part of how you would maximize the life years from transplant. So, okay, lots of experts, the clinicians are very enthusiastic about this. The doctors like this idea. And then after lunch, the first person who is neither a clinician nor a data scientist gets up to speak. This is Clive Graw. He, not PhD, but PKD, that's a rare genetic disease, polycystic kidney disease, that causes the kidneys to break down over time. And what he says, he's a traffic engineer in Los Angeles, but he's here as a patient in Dallas. He flew there to tell them, look, if people with my disease take good care of ourselves, we can decrease the demand for kidneys by using our own kidneys for longer. But under this system, where each kidney goes to whoever would get the most extra years of life out of it, I would effectively be punished for delaying the moment at which I begin to need a kidney. It's very unfair. Also, although age is one factor that predicts survival, there are many other factors that are not available in the data that also predict survival. So we could approach this differently. Anyway, it's important. For some reason, my notes aren't here, so I'm gonna. But the Clive was having kidney failure when he got up to give this talk at this meeting in Dallas. So there's something called the GFR, glomerular filtration rate, which is how well the kidneys are able to clean your blood. 60 and above is normal. 15 to 60 is kidney disease. So in other words, the lower the number is, the less able your kidneys are to keep you healthy. And at 15 is the threshold where you start to go on dialysis. He's got a GFR of 16 at the moment that he gets up to object against this utility maximizing plan. So the question is, what happened to that plan, and what happened after all to Clive? We'll get to that, but I want to take a step back first and tell you how this whole meeting came to be. And to do that, I want to take us back to 1960 and to the advent of Teflon, the same thing that is in those nonstick, or was often in nonstick pans for much of the 20th century. So dialysis is what we do if there is no working kidney. Person needs their blood. Kidneys do a lot of things, but the main one conventionally is that they clean toxins out of our blood. And if you don't have a working kidney, most of us, of course, have two, and one is enough for a healthy life. But if neither of your kidneys are working, then dialysis is a possibility. Take the blood out, filter it carefully, put it back in. This was first done actually in Holland during World War II. But there was a problem, which is every time we do this, we have to get all the blood out and put it back. And just as, for example, injecting drug users eventually have a problem where they run out of places to inject themselves, the large bore needle that you need to get blood in and out of a kidney patient, they had the same problem. So one source that I read described Lazarus-like recoveries that people would go through when they would begin to receive dialysis. But after about a month, there was nowhere else to put the needle, and they would die. Meanwhile, at this time in history, transplant has also just started. So there was one guy named of Herrick who needed a kidney transplant and happened to have an identical twin whose kidney had all the same proteins, immune stimulating proteins on it, and who got a kidney transplant in the 1950s and survived for many years. But for most people, kidney transplants between strangers are not yet feasible because the immunosuppressive drugs aren't there. So it's a really sort of tantalizing, stuck moment until Belding-Scribner in Seattle invents this Teflon tube, which allows for a permanent shunt in the person's arm. Now we can do dialysis over and over as many times as we please, potentially keeping people alive for many years. There's only one problem, though, which is that Scribner only has 4 dialysis machines, and there are thousands of patients dying of kidney failure who desperately need dialysis. So his lab is inundated with requests from patients and their doctors. So what does Scribner do about this? He does something fairly radical. He says, doctors can tell you who would benefit from getting dialysis, but it's not the doctor's job to ration care among people who are equally ready to benefit from the treatment. My job is to keep each of my patients alive as best I can, not to pick and choose. Nonetheless, there has to be rationing because there aren't enough seats. So this is what Scribner decides to do. The local medical society pulls together a group of lay people to decide from among those that the doctors deem medically eligible, which ones will receive a transplant. And this group, all men except for third from left is the one woman who was a housewife. Next to her on her right, you can see a clerical collar. We have limited information, much of it from this article, about how this committee thought about what it did. They didn't have explicit rules for deciding who should or should not get a kidney. Evidence seemed to suggest that they favored breadwinners with families to support. One pair of critics at the time wrote, this was again in Seattle, where Scribner and his invention had begun. And one pair of critics wrote that the Pacific Northwest is no place for a Henry David Thoreau with bad kidneys, because artists, creators, nonconformists were not going to be rewarded by this process. So this did not go over well, and it was quickly halted once it became national news. But it was also the beginning of a tradition that was still happening in Dallas in 2007, which is that lay people, not just clinicians, not just data scientists, had a meaningful voice in deciding the ethical choices that burden a process like this. Even though right now, in this historical case, we were talking about dialysis, and in Dallas, we were talking about transplants, still there's this continuity, I would posit, which is that we have lay people making decisions. And also, by the way, there's also a precedent here that not only do the moral choices belong to a wider community than just the technical experts, but also we need to educate people about how the technology works so that their lay input can be elicited and brought into the process. So these people were trained about how dialysis works, what the patients need to do. There was a restrictive diet, there were a whole bunch of details, and they got, enough there that they could make a picture of who they thought would be good for dialysis. So as I said, this committee was not long-lived, but the tradition of talking to lay people carried on. So between about 2004 and 2014, there was a decade-long debate in the United States about how to change the system that had given out kidneys, and that was mostly focused on, at this time, waiting time. In other words, it had become a mostly, how long have you been waiting, more like a queue. And people were pointing out that this was not efficient in terms of using the limited supply of organs, and that, so sometimes, for example, a very old organ with limited likely future life would go to a younger, healthier recipient, whereas younger and healthier organs would sometimes go to patients who were unlikely, even if transplanted with the best organ, to live for as long as the organ could. So there was a debate about how to balance this sense of giving everyone the same shot, which is represented here by the apple of equity, or maximizing or at least increasing total benefit, which is the orange of utility. And this image is from 2009. So this is about the midpoint of what people didn't know at the time, but what would turn out to be a decade-long debate. So the first idea, as I mentioned, was lift. This is what Clive Braw was arguing against in Dallas. And this graph depicts what fraction of all the kidneys go to people in each decade of life. So the pre-reform rules are this pink line, and the lift, and then this is transplants across blood types, this A2 to B thing, which that's, so quick sidebar on that is there are many, many more people who need kidneys who are people of color in the United States. The rate of kidney failure is 3 to 4 times as high in the African-American community as in the white community. A big piece of that is social determinants of health. So things like high blood pressure, diabetes, even stress can be contributory to kidney disease. And so with a pool of donated organs that more or less mirrors the US population, and with the fact that people of color are more likely to be blood type B, if you only give people kidneys that are from their same blood type, you effectively constrain what would otherwise be a net transfer of kidneys to the Black population, which has more of the kidney disease. And this was a way, thanks to some new medical technology, to break that barrier and send some blood type A kidneys to blood type B recipients. Anyway, the big idea here is that, as you can see, the Teal proposal, the new idea, would triple the amount of kidneys transplanted to people in their 20s, which sounds great, but would also reduce by half the fraction of kidneys going to people in their 50s. And so when Clive Graw got up to object to this system, he really hit a nerve. And in fact, there were brainstorming tables all around this room. And the number one thing that everyone came back with was, this is unfair to seniors. And of course, there also are other things about this that you might not like. I mean, in general, in the United States, the people with best access to healthcare, who, even if they do need a kidney, are less likely to have other health problems, are wealthier, younger, whiter than the rest of the population. So there are race equity and financial equity issues here as well. This proposal was dead on arrival in Dallas. So then the second of the 3 major ideas that they tried was called the 2880 proposal. Here, the idea was, okay, we hear you that we don't want age to be a reason why some people can't get kidneys. Let's keep everyone's chance of getting a kidney about the same based on their age as it is under the existing system. But let's reroute the kidneys so that the youngest, healthiest kidneys go to the youngest and healthiest 20% of recipients. And then for others, we'll do, by what they say here, age matching, meaning people in their 50s get kidneys from donors in their 50s. For reasons that are too complicated to get into here, that was seen as age discrimination and was eventually, after a long delay, ruled out by the Health and Human Services Department, which supervises this process of the federal government. Finally, we ended up with what I'm calling the final proposal, because it's the one that got implemented. This is what people called it then, although indeed the allocation process has continued to evolve since then, where the 20% of best kidneys does go to youngest and healthiest recipients. So it's, by the way, how much people would benefit is not just how long will you live if I give you a kidney, it's also, in the original LIFT idea, it is also how long would you live instead if I didn't give you one and you were on dialysis, and we're taking a delta. This is a little bit simpler because it's not specific to the pairing of a given kidney with a given recipient. It's just how attractive is this kidney in general and how long is this person likely to survive in general. So this is where we ended up. Now, a bunch of things happened here, but remember that scientific registry of transplant recipients that I pointed out in the beginning. They are a group that has a powerful role of analyzing what actually happens once this technology has gone into effect. And here, this is figure 13 from their annual report after the new algorithm takes effect. And you can see that thanks in part to that blood type A to blood type B transfer process, and also to some changes in the way that waiting time is calculated, the likelihood of getting a kidney per unit of time spent waiting is about the same over here for patients of different races, whereas earlier it was quite different. So that convergence is, one sign that something good was achieved, and also an illustration of the value of having auditing. So I came to this not as somebody who cares about kidney medicine as such, although I can say it's a fascinating field now that I have looked at it. But the thing that I wanted to know was, how can we do a better job of governing, particularly public sector algorithms? Because in places like the courtroom, where there's courtroom risk assessment that's done algorithmically, or social services offices where we decide who has a disability that needs to be compensated and what kind of compensation that they need, or even something like who can go to which school where there's an algorithm allocating, matching students. People have said there ought to be public participation. They've said there ought to be transparency. They've said there ought to be forecasting of potential consequences of proposed algorithms. And they've said there ought to be audits of how those algorithms are used. But people have said this without the benefit of having very many examples of those governance techniques actually used in a high stakes system. Whereas here, all of those techniques were used. So where do I think we can transplant these governance processes to other high stakes questions? Three things. One, I think when we need public confidence in a system's fairness, which we do here because the organs are gifts and it's a non-market situation. So people are less likely to decide to give an organ if they believe that it will not be given out fairly, and then the whole system doesn't work. But there are many other places, including, for example, courtrooms, where it's very important that we have public belief in a system's fairness and transparency and analysis that people can understand. So not just disclosure of stuff that an expert can decipher, but disclosures that people can easily understand, like those graphs that analyze trends for folks. I think those show a real value in helping people to understand and believe in a system. Secondly, I think rationing problems with public resources are a place where there's a real likelihood that these techniques might work even outside of medicine. And thirdly, where is it worth revisiting something to govern it more carefully? I think in cases in which the existing governance doesn't seem to be working very well. So, okay, fine. All right, David, you said you could transplant lessons from this medical context to courtrooms or schools or hiring. What can we learn? 6 quick things, and this is what I will conclude with. First, algorithms shift our moral attention. What do I mean by this? I think that when this debate happened, because of the way the software was set up, it was relatively easy to sort of tune a dial between maximizing total benefit and giving everyone an equal chance. And so that was something people talked a lot about. There were other things about this situation that were not as easy to adjust and that people didn't talk about, but that are very morally important. For example, at the time this debate was happening, the kidneys were gathered and often were given to patients within arbitrary geographic catchment areas called donation service areas that were basically an accident of history, which incidentally, as we speak, are in the process of being erased. But nobody thought they could revisit the geography, even though being in the right zone can triple or more your chance of getting an organ relative to being in the wrong zone. And by the way, people are able, if they have tremendous means, to list in multiple zones. So that wasn't on stage because it wasn't something that the dials could really get to. Another thing that wasn't on stage, this was all about taking people from the waiting list and deciding which of them will receive organs. But what we didn't have was the question of how do people get on the list in the first place? Who might belong on the list? Who's not already listed? And that's another thing where there are tremendous social and educational and access barriers such that people of less means, people from minoritized groups are much less likely, even when clinically suitable for transplant, to pursue it. And by the way, the transplant centers are rated quite strictly based on their success rate with transplant over a 5-year window. So much so that they can get shut down if their success rates aren't high enough. And the federal government, which will pay for dialysis forever for anyone who needs it, only pays for 3 years of the lifelong immunosuppression that you need after receiving a transplant. So if you are a surgical center and you're looking at someone who you think might in the future lack the means to purchase the suppression drugs because they don't have insurance to maintain the success of their transplant, then they could be a failure on your report card that determines whether you can stay open or not. I went to a meeting of surgeons and one of them told me, I can't afford to be a 95% surgeon in a 97% world. So what does this mean? It means that even when people who are disadvantaged socially or materially seek a transplant, they're likelier to get ruled out by the doctors than other patients are. Second, participation creates opinions. I may even have used the phrase public input earlier in this presentation. Certainly that's how I thought about it when I got started in this work, was like, you want to know what lay people think about what's fair so that you can include it in the design of some system. Basically, that's a measurement problem. You want to elicit their preferences. You want to detect what they believe. But here, over a 10-year period, something much more interesting and sort of organic happened, which is that people gradually changed each other's minds and gradually converged on a shared belief about what would be reasonable, what would be a step forward in fairness, if not a perfect system itself. I often think of like those machines that polish rocks, where they all sort of tumble together until the sharp edges are worn off. That's what this felt like as I came to see it more clearly. And that, I think, is a reminder of, I think if you're theorizing about how to govern AI of some kind, it's easy to sort of imagine that the ideal process will get you to the ideal answer. But in this case, and I think in others, there is no ideal answer. Not everyone whose life needs saving can be saved. And by the way, it's even more acute with things like hearts and lungs where there's no dialysis machine. So it really is transplant or die. It's tough. There is no perfect answer. And so in a situation like that, getting to a mutually tolerable compromise seems to me no small feat, especially in today's political environment. Third, shared understanding needs shared infrastructure. So what I mean is, transparency is a thing people talk about a lot, and they often mean, it might mean show me the source code or show me the detailed story of how this algorithm works. But in practice, only a small cadre of specialists is ever going to be able to directly use that information. And in fact, as we saw with Elon Musk asking people to print out source code from Twitter, and people said that's completely ridiculous. You can't, eyeball source code on a printout, right? You have to see how it runs in practice. That's true in general of source code. But more importantly, if you are not an expert, you need somebody who can tell you, look, here's how this would work out, we think, in practice, or here's how this is going for different racial groups, that kind of work. Now, admittedly, whoever has that job has enormous power to shape the perceptions of the system and thus to shape the debate. Nonetheless, I think forcing people to reinvent the wheel and do their own analyses, especially with respect to those who are least resourced, is not a recipe for success here. I think that centralizing the analysis in such a way that you can amortize its costs across all the participants seems to me a promising approach. Okay, fourth, deliberation is costly and its details matter. If I took this chair and said to somebody, pull up a chair, you're welcome at the table, your views can be included, we're ready to listen to you. On something as complicated as the transplant system, that imposes a burden on the person to show up, after work or whenever the meeting is, to get to the meeting in Dallas or wherever it is, or whatever the case may be, and especially the people whose participation we might be the most eager to elicit. Those who are not already having their interests represented, those are the people who are apt to be least able to spend resources telling us what it is that they want and need. And so doing deliberation in an inclusive way, whether that might mean, paying people, whether that might mean working through representatives, whether as it does in Brazil, where they have a process called participatory budgeting. It might mean things like having food and childcare available if you want parents in the evening to join in some kind of deliberative process. And not much of that, by the way, happened here. So I hope it hasn't seemed that I regard this process as in any sense a perfect one. I don't, but I think there's a lot we can learn here. Oscar Wilde once said, or at least was attributed to have said, that socialism will never work because there aren't enough evenings in the week. And I think that's a kind of truth that comes out whenever we start to talk about having people participate. I mean, I live in California. Infamously, the land use policies in California are victim to this. Anyone can participate in vetoing a proposed new construction of housing. It was created so that it would be harder for cities to route highways through underprivileged neighborhoods, which I think we can all be glad it's harder to do than it once was. On the other hand, it's now the case that privileged homeowners with lots of resources are using this to prevent the creation of more housing, and it's a huge crisis. So we have to look at the details of who can participate. Fifth, quantification can be a moral anesthetic. Now, in science and technology studies kinds of circles, people will often observe this and say it's a problem. They'll say that the computed nature of what a piece of software does or what AI does, prevents us from appreciating the moral substance of what's really going on. But just like medical anesthesia, I would argue that quantification, this sense of you had the higher score, therefore you get the kidney, or you had the lower score, therefore you don't. I think one of the things that does is that it allows us to make what would otherwise be, if sort of directly and humanely confronted, impossible choices about who to save, which, so there's work by Calabresi and Bobbitt. There's a book called Tragic Choices from the 1970s that's about this, which is to say, look, this process took 10 years. If, in the case I'm talking about, this transplant algorithm rewrite, when is that worth it? It's worth it when we can get to a better system that people think is really an improvement. If all we're going to do is argue about a thing that we're not able to do better on, then Calabresi and Bobbitt would question, and I would also question, whether that's the best use of our finite civic bandwidth. Lastly, knowledge and participation, even when we do create or enable them, don't always mean power. In other words, the situation when you have a special governance process set up for a certain algorithm, as indeed people do here, is still subject to the whims of the court system, of the legislature, of the executive. And there are various ways in which the work of this process was impinged upon. For example, shortly after the new algorithm was introduced, a lawsuit led a court to rule that the geographic catchment areas were contrary to law, and they were very, very swiftly eliminated. I think we have to realize that as we think about new ways of governing AI, we're talking about adding to what is already a complex ecology of governance practices. And with that, I'd love to get into the conversation.
Thank you so much, David. So yeah, we have 20 minutes roughly for questions, so we can start in the room here, and I'll also go up and see if we have some questions on the chat. But to start us off, does anybody have a question in the room?
Yeah.
Perhaps to play devil's advocate for a second to the sort of accountability and transparency arguments, a lot of people point to sort of deep learning or like algorithms that are much less interrogable than one where like there's sort of weights and measures and you can sort of divide the proportionality, draw it in the chart.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that this framing and this process of sort of participatory design can work in a system that's like far less specifically analyzable?
Yeah, this might be the naive humanist in me speaking, but I'm not in general that worried about the idea that certain technologies, because of their of their particular workings are less governable than others. Because what I would say is, no matter how the technology works, there is someone somewhere who built or is building it, who has a whiteboard, who's looking at what's happened, who's thinking, is this what I want to happen? It may be that in a particular case, they don't know why a given outcome occurred, but inevitably, they're doing something to build and refine whatever it is that they're making. And so what I would say is, that's the room that we're talking about trying to open up when we talk about transparency or when we talk about deliberation. And I am optimistic that anywhere where engineers can work, lay participants can, with the right care, be included. Yeah.
So whenever I think about this, I get a bit nihilistic, I think. Because many of the problems that we have, they kind of have this balance of kind of like free cognitive energy versus, you know, some level of automaticity or quantification. Like both the technological aspects and the social aspects of these things, they're always like, in the examples that you give, those are like really, really concrete, high stakes things, right? And you can lay it out and then you can put a framework on top of it. But like the great majority of like human creative, in my view, the great majority of like human creative intellectual activity around tools like this, regression, multi-level models, whatever, you know, whatever the things are that are the algorithms, right? Like they're like often teams or they're individuals, and they don't really, they've got key performance indicators, and they don't really have any grand context or grand stakes. They're reacting to what their manager says.
Right.
And like, and even in places where there should be a lot of transparency, like in academia, nobody shares their code properly. Nobody shares their data properly. You know, like, and that's not in a world of NDAs. That's not in the world, you know, like where there's, you know, in the corporate environment where there's non-disclosures and non-competes. And you can have someone like Elon Musk say, show me the source code, you know. I guess I feel paralyzed when the questions aren't as clear cut as X number of organs, Y number of people, Z number of years, or something like that. And I throw up my hands. I want to know, what is the technology? What is the context?
Yeah.
Because it sounds like that one of those last points that you made, it sounds to me like a lot of people are wasting a lot of time because they've just misspecified what they're up to. They say AI, decisions, something, frameworks. And then I get lost.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe in a partial response to the nihilism, I'll flip it around and say that for something to work like this instead of like that, the engineers work differently. Like I talked to the data scientists in UNOS. They even at one point, after the book was pretty much in press, called me because they were debating how many decimal points to calculate each person's allocation score out to. So this is the score that determines. Yes, exactly. Right. That's obviously the right answer.
Sorry.
Yes. And the thing was, and at first I thought, what could be more technical than that? Why is that a moral question? But the reason it's a moral question is they have architecture to calculate it out to umpteen decimal places. But once you do, it's not at all clear that the tiny, tiny, tiny difference in allocation score between Alice and Bob actually betokens a true clinical difference in how ready they are to benefit from a transplant. And so accepting, for argument's sake for the moment, that in some instances, they're able to calculate out a meaningless difference in scores. The question was, should we give out the organ based on the meaningless tiny difference in scores, or should we confess that these candidates are, as far as our current techniques permit us to detect, clinically equivalent and could benefit equally? And maybe what we need to do, even though we don't like to do this kind of thing, maybe the fair thing to do is to flip a coin between them. And so, okay, so my point about that story is the data scientists raised their hands and said, hang on, this is not a question just for us. And I think that kind of, it's true, there are many contexts in which it wouldn't be clear when to do that. Yeah. But I also think there are many engineering cultures where there's just not the practice of doing.
Well, so I'm
Yeah.
gonna push back on that. I'm gonna say that, yes, so that's the problem of false precision. Yes, it's great that those engineers with that clearly specified problem have kind of come up with asking how many decimal point, blah, 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 information, compute, whatever. But like, we have other types of engineers in our societies that have these debates. When you build a bridge,
Mhm.
you have certification, you have licensing, you have responsibility that the bridges have enough cement in them so that they don't fall down.
Yes.
And so there is an explicit structure around specific problems that society enforces
Yes.
because people die.
Right.
And I guess without that, it just makes it hard for me to see abstract algorithmic decisions without that frame.
Well, and maybe to strengthen your argument, or to kind of friendly amend, part of it is that, we don't have lay people committees for bridges. So
Gotcha.
you might ask why
Yeah.
we should have them here. You might say, look, we live in a democracy is in principle the situation to begin with. So that's how people have their voice. The laws that this thing has to operate under were written by elected legislators. We don't need any more democracy than that. This is an argument that Johannes Himmelreich, who's now at Syracuse, has made forcefully. I would say that there are situations in which the moral stakes are clear. I agree with you that they are the exception rather than the rule. But in those cases, we've seen such poorly governed systems in many of them that this seems to me that it's a least bad approach for some real problems. I don't think at all that it's something that would work for every situation in which AI is doing something whose moral consequences are worth caring about.
Yes, thank you.
I might ask a question if it's all right. So you talked a bit about having shared infrastructure, so having analyses that are sort of digestible for lay people as well as experts. And some work I've done looked at that in the context of non-discrimination law and anti-discrimination law, where in court, quite often what you get is essentially a battle of statistics that is won by whoever has more resources, or who can present statistics in the most convincing way to the court. And so I'm wondering, sort of in this context and other contexts where we're trying to build that shared infrastructure, who do you think should choose which analyses are done and which ones are shared?
I mean, I think this is inescapably a question for the fair-minded expert we hope can exist in this institutional situation, right? It's not gonna, the lay people, I mean, well, yeah, thinking out loud, maybe it is important to let people pose questions to the analysis facility and say, I'm curious about X, you haven't analyzed. Is it possible to learn more about this or that facet? Which incidentally, the committees that plan this stuff, they do have a situation like that. They make data requests and analysis requests of the third party. So maybe part of it is that decision can itself be shared. I'm a little antsy here because my fear is there's a regress. Like you could say, who gets to set up the system under which requests get made? Shouldn't that also have public input and so on? So at some point, I think there is a situation where there's a kind of fiduciary responsibility that experts have to lay people. I think that's the spirit of where a lot of this comes from.
So we do have a question online as well, but maybe we have okay. So yeah, I'll just read out the question from the Zoom call then. So John asks, the example from the 60s is really interesting. The doctors created the panel to make the decisions, it seems, because on one level, the moral weight of the decision as to who is allocated a kidney is too great. This is an important aspect of ethical decision making, though. On a fundamental level, humans have ethical connections to each other when making these decisions about other humans. So do you think this is something that should factor into decisions that are made with AI?
I think for this committee, interestingly, the details of people's lives were very there weren't really records. One of the things I was curious about was race equity. Seems like all the people on the committee were white. Not everyone with kidney failure is white. Not everyone who lived in Seattle in 1960 was white. What happened? And I didn't get aggregate information about that. But what I did find was that there was one instance in which they met face to face with somebody who needed a kidney. And it happened that this was a Chinese American person who I think had been denied and then said, why have you denied? And, you know, their meetings weren't public, the locations weren't public. And somehow this guy's attorney had figured out where and when this meeting was happening. And this patient came and made a personal appeal directly to the deciders. And the upshot was that they did get a transplant. So perhaps that goes to the questioner's point. Of course, when there's a shortage of organs, not everyone can benefit in the form of an organ from such an appeal. So it's, yeah, it's tricky.
I have another question if somebody else in the room has one.
A question to follow on from the question from Zoom, which is like, to some ways you could see the creation of that committee as the doctors recognizing sort of a moral responsibility and saying, we don't want this moral responsibility, someone else has got to do it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Hot potato.
Exactly. I feel like right now, though, in the AI space, there's not even a question of who takes them. Like, I'm not sure that many engineers would even admit that they had moral responsibility in the first place, right? Like the doctors in that scenario had to recognize that they were going to have some responsibility in order to want to hot potato to someone else. Whereas, like, I don't feel like there is a culture or even a shared understanding of like who deserves the responsibility for things that go wrong in algorithmic systems. Do you think that's a sort of cultural distinction of the medical profession, or is that something to do with the specific sort of duties of care they have to patients? Like, and what are ways you think that sort of perhaps assigning responsibility in the algorithmic space could lead to more intentional thought?
Yeah, I mean, it is cultural. I think culture is a good word for this. And certainly in the medical world, although triage is obviously a medical phenomenon, I think off the battlefield, there's a real reluctance to kind of to pick and choose. And certainly there is a strong reluctance to explicit acknowledgement of picking and choosing. Witness what happened in the Obamacare debate with the idea of death panels, which this basically arguably was. You know, that's really, really hard. But I also think that you know, I used to think that technical experts sort of had this habit of imperiously grabbing the moral microphone and making the choices and cloaking them as technical, because, and I think that came from reading a lot of STS scholarship where people would say things like this choice, which was, you know, treated as technical, was really moral. I now see it differently. I think what often happens is that nobody wants to acknowledge. It's not only the engineers who don't want to acknowledge that the choice is a moral one. It's also true that others want to say, please resolve this on technical grounds. For example, in the statute that governs US organ allocation, Congress has directed that organs be allocated based on, quote, medical criteria, unquote. Now, if two people are clinically equivalent, but have slightly different scores, is that medical criteria that in some way rescue us either from having, or at least from admitting that we have a tough moral question to answer? I think, you know, so Congress too wanted to avoid. So I think that it's not only, I guess my response in part is to say that I think the question is even bigger than the part of it that we were talking about here, which is, it's not only the culture of the engineers that needs to change, but also the culture of the rest of us, that we need to not pretend that moral questions are technical ones instead. And we need to not abdicate our moral franchise to technical experts.
Can I ask a very quick follow-up to that, which is, so like, I think that I found it interesting the last week, to go back to the Twitter and Musk example that provides so many weird examples. There's been reporting that like Musk had hired so many lawyers that they were going to ask engineers to like certify these FTC rules and say like, we checked that this code protects privacy or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Do you think models like that like basically assign weight to someone. Or assign sort of responsibility to someone. Are a step in the right direction, because then at least that person is then incentivized to figure out how to share that responsibility or pass it around.
I mean, someone somewhere's gotta, admit that there's a moral choice being made. And I think that itself in some way is a contribution. If you think that this choice could be made much better if we only thought about it honestly, then you can kind of raise the alarm and be like, okay, bat away that quantitative anesthesia. Let's look at what's really happening here. And I think that's a lot of what activists do when they object against new applications of automation, is they sort of say, this isn't just numbers, there's a human story here, and we need to change that human story in part by no longer pretending that it's all just numbers.
Maybe to just ask one final question, then, since we're coming up on 1 o'clock. I was wondering, do you have any sort of general thoughts, general recommendations, best practices in terms of choosing who gets to sit around the table? So you have the right voices at the table. I'm thinking in particular, is it better to have lay members of the public, or should you try to find some sort of civil society organization that, say, represents a certain part of the public?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a vital question. I wish I'd done more about how the handful of lay people got onto these committees. I think the basic answer may be that doctors pick them. That's different from what Clive Raw did, where he went to a public meeting, but he was not specifically chosen or invited, but he said, I have something to say. So, you could look at this example and be pessimistic about capture. On the other hand, the algorithm that came out of this process was totally different than the one that the experts alone would have designed. I think it's a per problem question, for example, are there suitable civil society groups who can serve as proxies in this setting? Sometimes the true answer to that question is yes. Sometimes it's no. And you kind of have to constitute a group to deliberate. And I'll also just say one other thing, which is any deliberative process, it's always possible to say so-and-so was outside, right? Because unless we're talking about the community of all life, there's somebody somewhere who's not part of the circle of deliberators. So even though I'm saying we need to widen the circle and include lay people more often, I also think that at some point you have to say, this is good enough, we're going to muddle through, we're going to give this a shot, even though it's imperfect. And I think that is basically my great hope with this work, just to kind of maybe close on this, is to say that I don't want the theoretical perfect to be the enemy of the actual better than what we've got. If we can make incremental progress toward, a better morality in the way that we use automation, I'd like to see us do that. And I think for all of us who study this, admiration of the problem has gone long enough, and it's time for a bit of a pivot toward imperfect modeling, toward improvements. And I hope this can be part of that.
Great, that's a fantastic note to end on. So thank you so much again, David.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for being on.
Thank everybody that joined us online. There will be a recording of this available too, for anybody that wants to go back and have a look at anything. But yes, thank you.